Get ready for a deep dive into the complex life of a complex man who originated the complex idea of what was known as complex marriage. He was a minister, a utopian leader, a philosopher of sorts, an iconoclast, and one naughty boy. We, of course, are talking about the inscrutable John Humphrey Noyes, the founder and leader of the controversial free love Oneida community. Hello again, friends, and welcome to the latest episode of Lost and Unfound, where we discuss people and places that have been largely ignored or forgotten by times gone by. Our aim is to learn more about the formerly famous and the infamous and resuscitate them here. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. John Humphrey Noyes was born in Brattleboro, Vermont in September of 1811. He was the namesake of John Sr., who was a minister and later a U.S. representative in that small southern Vermont town near the Massachusetts border. His mother was Polly, maiden name Hayes, and that's important. She was the aunt of the future President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. So he has quite a family pedigree. But as we'll soon learn, he would fly far from the flock, but nevertheless he too would become prominent in his own eccentric terms. And a quick aside here as we get going, I find it interesting that three famous religious nonconformists of the day, all of whom were contemporaries, were born in tiny and bucolic Vermont. And these three were Noyes and two others that would far surpass him in notoriety and influence, those other two being the founders and leaders of Mormonism, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. He was known as a keen student, and in his teens headed off to the Ivy League, Dartmouth in particular. He eventually graduated, but it was during these college years he underwent a transformational religious conversion after attending the revivals of the radical Presbyterian minister and reformer Charles Grandison Finney, a prominent leader of what is known to history as the Second Great Awakening, which inspired religious fervor all throughout New York and New England at that time. After finding the Lord, he abandoned his law studies and was soon off to seminary in Andover, Massachusetts, before switching to the Yale Theological Seminary to further immerse himself in the Bible and prepare for a career dedicated to Christian ministry. While in his first year at New Haven, he helped organize one of the first anti-slavery societies in the United States. But it was a revelation that came to him which would define his unorthodox beliefs and teachings for the remainder of his life. As he assiduously scoured the Bible for clues that would indicate the date of Christ's second coming, he became convinced the event had already happened. In fact, he pegged his belief in this startling resurrection right down to the exact year, 70 AD. This led him to proclaim that, quote, man was living in a new age. These discoveries set him on a self-righteous path in pursuit of what he called perfectionism. His wildly contrarian view was that to be a true Christian, one had to be completely free of sin. Otherwise, Christianity was a lie. Needless to say, this put him at odds with his fellow seminarians and launched a lifelong struggle against convention. In 1834, having received his formal license to preach, he shockingly declared himself, quote, perfect and free from sin. Well, guess what? License to preach was revoked, and he was banished from Yale. Our self-contented prophet next turns up in Putney, Vermont, where he ignores this revocation and he goes about preaching. He says of his former professors and classmates, and he proclaims, I took away their license to sin, and they go on sinning. They took away my license to preach, and I go on preaching. In 1838, Noyes married a woman named Harriet Holton, and within 6 years, she gave birth 5 times, but just one child survived through infancy, and sadly, of course, that was not unusual in that era. Despite this heartache, these early stages of their marriage seemed quite conventional. But this was soon to change as the first rumblings of the salacious reputation for which he is probably most remembered would come to the fore. Now, maybe it was cabin fever brought on by the bitter cold Vermont winters, and trust me, I know, I grew up there. But Mr. Perfection gets the wandering eye for the wife of one of his early followers. that follower being a man named George Craggan. But always the iconoclast, Noyes addresses his lustful thirstings in a very unorthodox manner. He doesn't ravage her in the barn or sneak her downstairs to the basement. No, of course not. He's not a philanderer. He's perfect, remember? Instead, he sat down with the Craggans and his wife Harriet and calmly explained to them his new theory of complex marriage, aka swinging, by which both women and both men would enter into a mutual marital pact. Rather than kick his ass or call the cops, this proposition sounded perfectly fine to the Craggans, and the two married couples moved into a common house soon after. Now, it's easy to laugh at this early example of sexual experimentation, and I do. But for Noyes, this was much more serious than some sort of horny attempt to hook up with his new housemates. This was his first attempt at promoting the idea of male continence, by which the male constrains himself from ejaculation during sexual intercourse. More on this later. Soon word of this gets around town, and what do you know? Male converts start lining up and are then gradually, excitedly or reluctantly, I don't know, followed by widows, unhappily married women, and some young girls as well. So hey, there's a perfection party in Putney tonight, and everyone's invited.
Ooh la la.
Well, most of the neighbors in the strictly Puritan Putney did not RSVP, and predictably, charges were brought against Noyes and others for, quote, adulterous fornication, which kind of seems like an understatement to me. Learning of this, he and a few of his followers hurriedly left town en route to the New York village of Oneida, which was home to an offshoot of the group led by a man named Jonathan Burt, who offered land and acceptance. It was there where John Humphrey Noyes would build his free love utopia and etch his name in the history books forever. But before we divine a better understanding of what the Oneida community was, let's discuss a little more about what Noyes really believed. And because it's so controversial and seemingly so contradictory, and because this is a podcast and not a lecture, probably best to simply lay out some of his tenets in bullet point form. So here's some of them. 1. It is possible to live a life free of sin. 2. By surrendering one's will to God, everything he chooses to do is perfect because his actions are derived from a, quote, perfect heart. 3. Man has an independent will because of God, and therefore his will is divine. 4. The only way to control will is through spiritual direction. And then he proclaims, quote, it was impossible for the church to compel man to obey the law of God, and to send him to eternal damnation for his failure to do so. Gee, wonder why he got kicked out of a Christian divinity school. Okay, now let's get on our horses and board our wagons and travel next door to the central New York hamlet of Oneida, where the small band of renegade perfectionists hastily constructed an admittedly imperfect communal dwelling as their first home base. Some members also initially lived in existing ramshackle structures, as well as a few cabins previously occupied by members of the Oneida Nation band of Indians that were the original occupants of the land. But simultaneously, the group got straight to work on what was called the Mansion House, which was intended to be the organization's communal living and sleeping quarters. And this, and eventual further expansions of the building, would be the epicenter of the community for the 30-plus years of its existence in Oneida. Upon the completion of the first iteration of the Mansion House, all members were required to live there, and all meals were shared together in the expansive dining hall. Unsurprisingly, the building included many quirky attributes, notably the tent room, which consisted of a series of indoor tents, with the purpose being that full privacy and isolation was discouraged and even prevented, and that public discourse, and I guess intercourse, was encouraged. Within a few years, the community grew gradually but consistently, and by the mid-1850s counted 170 members among the flock. The in-house newsletter, as it were, remarked that, quote, smallness of space has served as a compress on excessive individuality and brought an element of communism. Now, let's put that last word in brief context here. Noyes preached what he called Bible communism, and it was a hallmark of his own philosophy. But we have to remember that although these years did directly coincide with the advent, really, of Marxism, as we know it, he had been using this word for years before and had no real political or direct economic connotation. It simply meant community as ordered by his peculiar teachings. In 1861, a new 3-story brick addition had been added to accommodate a population now approaching almost 300, and this followed the next year by more living space. As the group grew, it established satellite branches in Brooklyn, Newark, and Wallingford, Connecticut. Oneida was a self-supporting and industrious place as well as a spiritual one. It raised funds through various endeavors, such as the manufacture of everything from animal traps to leather goods and clothing, canned vegetables and fruit. One they were most known for, however, is the production of something you may have in your house right now, or certainly have used at one time or another, and that is the silverware. Oneida silverware, anyone? Well, let's get to the juicy part, if one can call it that. I've been poring over a lot of pictures of Oneida members, and it's not exactly OnlyFans material. Okay, let's try to get serious here. That's not always easy on this topic, but we'll give it a go, pun intended. As alluded to earlier, central to Noyes' teachings was what he called complex marriage, as achieved by male continence. He believed the sexual organs could be defined by 3 functions: the urinary, that's obvious, the propagative, to procreate, and the amative, to exhibit and express the sensual and the sexual. Noyes contended that the amative and the propagative were totally separate, and the amative was just another form of social interaction that did not require ejaculation. Therefore, at Oneida, postmenopausal women were encouraged to essentially help train the virile men in the group to keep it to themselves. It's a bit wordy, but I'm going to quote him directly from his 1848 book on the subject called Male Continence, whereby he refers to normal intercourse as a momentary affair terminating in exhaustion and disgust. If it begins in the spirit, it soon ends in the flesh, i.e. the amative, which is spiritual, is drowned in the propagative, which is sensual. The exhaustion which follows naturally breeds self-reproach and shame, and this leads to dislike and concealment of the sexual organs, which contract disagreeable associations from the fact they are instruments of pernicious excess. This undoubtedly is the philosophy of the origin of shame after the fall. And he goes on to say, Adam and Eve first shrunk the spiritual in the sensual by eating the forbidden fruit. And then, by having lost the true balance of their natures, they sunk the spiritual in the sensual in their intercourse with each other, by pushing prematurely beyond the amative to the propagative, and so became ashamed and began to look with an evil eye on the instruments of their folly. Whoa, Nelly, what a page-turner. And think of it, this man recruited hundreds and hundreds of followers. He must have been an incredible salesman. All coitus within the community was known to be consensual, and each tryst was officially sanctioned and documented.
Sexy.
As a result of this highly regulated environment, births were rare. When they did occur, the child was raised communally, and not by either or both parents, as that was strictly forbidden. Well, although weird as hell, it all seems very clinical. There is the inevitable catch, though. Yep. The virgins and other fair maidens were reserved for Noyes and other veteran male members of the community that he decided had mastered the art of male continence. So here we go, paging Warren Jeffs. Though the Oneida community had existed mostly without legal incident for more than its 30 years in existence, Noyes was tipped off that he was about to be arrested for statutory rape, and he fled in the dead of night across the Canadian border into Ontario, never to return again. He sent word back to his flock to dissolve the community and convert it into a joint stock company, which it did in 1881. John Humphrey Noyes died lonely and mostly forgotten, and probably horny, on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls in 1886 at the age of 74. Now beyond the long arm of the law, his remains were returned to Oneida, and he is buried there along with many of his former followers. His son, Pierpont, took over the Oneida organization and consolidated its many cottage industries into the sole production of the silverware for which it's most remembered, and this company was the largest producer in the world throughout a good portion of the 20th century. The Mansion House is today a multi-use facility that is comprised of meeting spaces, apartments, a museum, and a banquet hall. There are even guest rooms, and if you're so inclined, you can bring a significant other there and spend a night practicing complex marriage.
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Keep watching on YouTube or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the socials. New episodes drop regularly. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. It really does help us create new and fresh content. And be sure to check out our companion site, Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. Copyright Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.